I first noticed a change in Jake a few weeks ago, right around the time the Christmas decorations began to light up the neighborhood. Jake, my charming and ever-helpful neighbor, had always been friendly. But lately, there was something different about him. It wasn't just the way he greeted me or his playful compliments about my appearance. It was the way he lingered. The way his eyes seemed to hold on to mine just a little longer than before. Jake was in his late 20s, full of life and energy, with a personality that could brighten even the dullest day. As a graphic designer who worked from home, he was a regular presence in my life. Our houses were separated by a small fence, barely tall enough to provide privacy, and I often caught glimpses of him through the windows. Whether he was sketching on his porch or sipping coffee, there was something magnetic about him. His easy charm and infectious laugh made people gravitate toward him, and I wasn't immune. Since I moved into this house after my husband passed away, Jake had been a constant presence. He always seemed to know when I needed help, whether it was fixing a leaking faucet, carrying heavy groceries, or offering a kind word on a hard day. At first, I thought he was just being kind, a friendly neighbor stepping in to lend a hand during a difficult time. But now, I wasn't so sure. It started with his compliments. Mrs. Lynette, he'd say with that boyish grin that made my heart flutter, "You must have found the fountain of youth. You look better than most women in their 30s. Then he'd wink, leaving me both flattered and slightly flustered. I used to laugh it off, telling myself he was just being playful, but his words stayed with me longer than they should have. I found myself looking in the mirror more often, smoothing my hair and adding a touch of lipstick before stepping outside. It felt silly, almost like I was a teenager with a crush. But then his visits started lasting longer. If he came over to fix something, he'd linger afterward, leaning against the counter and striking up conversations that stretched for hours. We talked about everything: my life with my late husband, his dreams of starting his own design studio, the quirks of our neighborhood. He listened with an intensity that made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. One evening, I decided to test my theory. I stood at my kitchen window, watching as Jake tinkered with something on his porch. The warm glow of the porch light cast a golden halo around him, highlighting his strong jawline and the messy curls in his hair. "Jake," I called out, my voice carrying across the short distance. He looked up immediately, a smile already forming. "Need me to save the day again, Mrs. Lynette?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Can you help me with something?" Within minutes, he was at my door, stepping inside with the ease of someone who belonged there. He wore a simple hoodie and jeans, yet somehow made it look effortlessly good. "What's the emergency this time?" he teased, his eyes sparkling with mischief. I pointed to the top shelf of my kitchen cabinet, where a jar of sugar sat just out of reach. "I can't seem to get to it," I said, trying to sound casual. He chuckled, shaking his head as he moved to the cabinet. "You know, you could just buy a step stool," he said, grabbing the jar with ease. "Where's the fun in that?" I replied, crossing my arms and leaning against the counter. As he handed me the jar, his eyes lingered on mine. For a moment, the teasing smile faded. "You're just finding excuses to call me over, aren't you?" he asked softly, his tone serious now. His words caught me off guard, and warmth spread across my cheeks. "And what if I am?" I whispered. His gaze held mine, and the playful banter between us dissolved into something deeper. The air between us grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. For a moment, I thought he might step closer, might say something to bridge the gap between us. But then the clock on the wall chimed, breaking the spell. Jake blinked, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well, if you ever need an excuse, you know where to find me," he said, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. And just like that, the moment passed. After he left, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the jar of sugar in my hands. My heart raced, my thoughts swirling with questions I wasn't ready to answer. What was I doing? Jake was young, vibrant, and full of possibilities. I was a widow, still carrying the weight of a love I'd lost. But despite my doubts, I couldn't deny how he made me feel alive, wanted, seen. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed that night, I realized something had shifted between us. Whether it was the beginning of something new or just a fleeting moment, I didn't know. All I knew was that Jake had become more than just a kind neighbor, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what that meant. In the days that followed, I found myself calling Jake over more often. At first, the reason seemed practical: changing a light bulb, fixing a squeaky door, or moving something heavy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't really about the tasks anymore. It was about Jake, the way his presence filled the house, softening the sharp edges of my grief with his laughter, and the way he looked at me like I was more than just a lonely widow next door. One particular afternoon, Jake was kneeling by the kitchen cabinet, repairing a loose hinge. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw and the strong forearms exposed by his rolled-up sleeves. I found myself staring, lost in thought, until he looked up and caught me red-handed. His brows lifted in amusement, and the corner of his mouth curved into a sly smile. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "you're not as subtle as you think." My heart raced. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, feigning innocence as I quickly turned to busy myself with a dish towel. He chuckled, standing up and brushing his hands off. "Sure you don't," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "But for the record, I don't mind." That evening, I sat alone in my dimly lit living room with a glass of wine in hand, replaying the moment in my mind. Was he teasing, or was there something more in his tone? Something I hadn't dared to name yet? The idea thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. I had spent so long building walls around my heart, shielding it from the pain of loss. But Jake made me wonder if it was time to let those walls come down. The next morning, my thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When I opened it, Jake stood there holding a small potted poinsettia. Its vibrant red leaves a striking contrast against the gray December sky. "For your Christmas decorations," he said warmly. I smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Jake. That's very thoughtful of you. Anything for you, Mrs. Lynette," he replied with a wink that sent a warm flush to my cheeks. In the days that followed, Jake seemed to find even more reasons to stop by. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a box of chocolates, a book he thought I'd enjoy, or a loaf of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. Other times, he'd come just to talk, sharing stories about his work or his dreams for the future. One evening, as we stood by the fence separating our houses, he surprised me with an invitation. "Come over for dinner," he said with his signature smile. "I promise I won't burn anything." At first, I hesitated. The idea of stepping into his space, into his life, felt like crossing an invisible line. But the thought of another quiet, lonely evening at home was too much to bear. "All right," I said finally, trying to sound casual. "But if I don't like it, I'm ordering pizza." He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that warmed me more than I cared to admit. Jake's house was cozy and full of character. The walls were adorned with his sketches and paintings, landscapes, portraits, and abstract designs that hinted at the depths of his creativity. The faint scent of cinnamon and cloves lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of whatever he was cooking. As we sat across from each other at his small dining table, sharing stories and laughter, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. He asked me about my life before moving here, about my hobbies and dreams, and he listened with a kind of attentiveness that made me feel truly valued. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine across the table. I looked down, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "You're sweet, Jake, but you don't have to flatter me." "It's not flattery," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's just the truth. As much as I cherish these moments, they also stirred a nagging fear. What was this between us? Was it just a deep friendship, or was it something more? And if it was more, was I ready for it? I hadn't allowed myself to feel this way about anyone since my husband passed. The idea of opening my heart again, of risking the pain of loss, was daunting. And then there was our age difference. What would people think? What would they say if they saw us together? These questions swirled in my mind, keeping me awake long after I returned home that night. But even amidst my doubts, one thing was clear. Jake had brought a light into my life that I hadn't realized I was missing. As Christmas Eve approached, I found myself thinking about Jake more than anything else. His laughter, his kindness, and his unwavering support made the season feel brighter than it had in years. Since my husband's passing, Christmas had been bittersweet, a reminder of what I had lost. But this year was different. This year, Jake had made me feel alive again. Still, a part of me hesitated. Was I reading too much into his actions? Could this simply be a kind young man trying to cheer up his lonely neighbor? Deep down, I already knew the answer. That morning, I woke up with a nervous energy that carried me through the day. I wanted everything to be perfect, not just for him, but for us. This wasn't just any evening. It was special, and I wanted Jake to feel that. I spent the day transforming my living room into a warm, inviting space. Candles flickered on every available surface, casting a soft golden glow. I baked his favorite cookies, chocolate chip with a hint of cinnamon, and arranged them on a platter. The scent of pine from the Christmas tree mingled with the cookies' aroma, filling the house with warmth. A bottle of red wine sat on the coffee table, flanked by 2 crystal glasses I hadn't touched in years. I even dusted off an old record player and found the perfect Christmas playlist, soft, soulful melodies that spoke of love and hope. When everything was ready, I stood back and surveyed the room. It felt magical, perfect for the evening I had envisioned. My heart raced at the thought of Jake stepping through the door and seeing what I had done. When Jake finally arrived, his reaction was everything I had hoped for this moment. But nothing could have prepared me for it. "Wow," Jake said, his voice filled with genuine wonder as his eyes roamed the room. He took in the soft glow of the candles, the carefully arranged cookies, the wine, and finally me. "Mrs. Lynette, this is incredible." I smiled, feeling the warmth of his gaze, like sunlight on a cold winter's day. "It's Christmas Eve. I wanted to do something special for you. You've been so kind to me, Jake, more than you know. I just wanted to show you how much I appreciate everything you've done." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice gentle, "but thank you. It's perfect." We spent the evening on the couch, sipping wine and talking. Conversation with Jake had always been easy, but tonight felt different. There was a closeness between us, an unspoken understanding that made every word feel heavier, more meaningful. At one point, the music shifted to a slow, dreamy ballad. Jake stood up suddenly, holding out his hand. "Dance with me," he said, his voice low and inviting. A nervous laugh escaped my lips. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," he replied with a grin. "But I'm willing to risk it if you are." His hand was warm and steady as I placed mine in his. He pulled me to my feet and into his arms. Together, we swayed to the music. His hands rested lightly on my waist, and I let mine settle on his shoulders, feeling the strength beneath his shirt. We moved slowly, the world around us fading until it was just the two of us. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so safe, so cherished. As the song played on, the mood shifted. The laughter and light-heartedness gave way to a quiet stillness, a sense of something unspoken but deeply felt. Jake's hands tightened slightly on my waist, and I looked up to find his eyes searching mine. Neither of us said a word. The air between us was electric, charged with the weight of everything we had left unsaid. Then he leaned in. The space between us, once so uncertain, disappeared in a moment that felt as fragile as glass, yet as powerful as a rushing river. His movements were slow, almost hesitant, as if asking a silent question, one I had already answered in my heart long before this night. When his lips met mine, it wasn't sudden or hurried. It was soft, like the first drops of rain after a long, dry season. His lips were warm, their touch gentle and thoughtful, as though he feared breaking something precious. At first, it was a brush, a whisper of connection, tentative and testing. He lingered for a heartbeat, as if giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I stayed. The quiet in the room seemed to wrap itself around us, amplifying the rhythm of my heart, which was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. My pulse raced, not from fear or worry, but from the unexpected thrill of something beautiful beginning to bloom. As the kiss deepened, it wasn't hurried or demanding. It was purposeful, every movement unhurried, every touch filled with care. It felt like he was taking the time to memorize the moment, to make it last longer than just now. His lips moved in a way that seemed to speak without words, as though telling me something he had kept inside for too long. A warmth spread through me, starting from the point where our lips met and flowing outward like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was emotional, a kind of gentle healing I hadn't realized I needed. His hand lifted slowly, his fingers grazing my cheek. The touch was light, like a feather against my skin, but it sent a shiver through me nonetheless. He cradled my face in his palm, his thumb softly tracing a line along my cheekbone, as if reassuring me that this was real, that we were here. There was no noise except the faint crackle of a candle burning nearby, its flickering light casting shadows that danced along the walls. Even the world outside seemed to hold its breath, as though respecting the sacredness of this moment. I found myself leaning into him, not just physically, but emotionally, letting go of the walls I had carefully built around my heart. This wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that pain hadn't existed. This was about stepping into something new, something that felt pure and hopeful. As his lips moved against mine, the kiss became an unspoken language, a way of communicating things words could never fully capture. It was filled with patience, kindness, and a quiet promise that felt as steady as the ground beneath our feet. My hands, almost of their own accord, reached up to rest gently against his chest. I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my fingers, strong and grounding. It matched the tempo of my own, a quiet synchronization that made me feel as though we were connected on a deeper level than I had thought possible. When the kiss finally broke, it wasn't abrupt. It ended like the closing of a favorite book, gently, with the promise of more to come. He didn't pull away completely, but stayed close, his forehead resting lightly against mine. Our breaths mingled, shallow and warm, as we stood there, neither of us willing to move too quickly and break the spell. His eyes, when they met mine, were soft, filled with something unspoken but undeniably real. The room felt warmer, as though the candles had burned a little brighter just for us. His hand lingered on my cheek, a quiet reassurance that this wasn't a fleeting moment, but the beginning of something neither of us had dared to hope for. For the first time in what felt like forever, my heart wasn't weighed down by loss or fear. It was freed. It was light, buoyant, as though my heart had found a reason to beat a little faster, a little stronger. And as I looked into his eyes, I knew he felt it too. I began, my voice faltering as I searched for the right words to capture what I was feeling. Amazing, he finished softly, his voice carrying the same awe that was written across his face. I nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips, unable to contain the warmth spreading through me. Yes, I murmured, my voice steady now. It was, in that moment, with the glow of candles around us and the soft timbre of music in the background, I realized something. That night had changed everything. It wasn't just about the kiss, or the way Jake's arms felt around me. It wasn't just a fleeting moment or a holiday fling. It was about what it symbolized, the beginning of something real, something beautiful. For years, I had been trapped in a world of my own making, surrounded by walls I'd built after my husband passed away. Those walls were meant to keep me safe from pain, from loss, from the possibility of getting hurt again. Men had tried to approach me, to pull me out of my solitude, but I always resisted. It wasn't that they weren't kind or charming. It was that I couldn't bear the thought of letting anyone into a space still haunted by my past. I wasn't just guarding my heart. I was guarding the memory of my late husband, clinging to it like a lifeboat in a stormy sea. But with Jake, it was different. He didn't force his way in or demand anything from me. Instead, he simply existed, offering quiet companionship and kindness until, without even realizing it, I had let him in. He didn't just knock on the door of my heart. He quietly walked in and made himself at home. As we sat together on the couch that night, the world outside seemed to fade away. The glow of the candles softened everything around us, and the gentle hum of Christmas music in the background felt like a soundtrack to this unexpected moment. Jake leaned back, cradling his wine glass in one hand, and looked at me with an expression that made my heart skip a beat. It wasn't just admiration or attraction. It was something deeper, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. I always thought Christmas was overrated, Jake admitted, swirling his wine thoughtfully. Until this year, I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And what's so different about this year? His eyes met mine, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then, with a small smile, he said, "You." My breath caught in my throat. It was such a simple word, but the way he said it, with such sincerity, left me speechless. As the hours passed, the reality of our situation began to creep into my mind. I couldn't help but think about how society might view our relationship. I was older, a widow with a lifetime of experiences behind me, while Jake was young, vibrant, and full of energy. "Jake," I began, setting my wine glass down and turning to face him, "have you thought about what people might say?" He frowned slightly, as if the thought had never occurred to him. "What people?" "Neighbors, friends, family," I said, gesturing vaguely. "People love to talk, and we're not exactly what you'd call a conventional pair." Jake leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Do you care what they think?" I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. "I guess I've always cared, to some extent." "Well, I don't," he said firmly. "Let them talk. Let them say whatever they want. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how we feel about each other." His words hung in the air, bold and unwavering. And as I looked at him, saw the determination in his eyes, I realized he was right. Life was too short to be lived for anyone else's approval. For the first time in years, I felt truly happy, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away from me. The night began to wind down, but neither of us seemed eager to let it end. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, and the bottle of wine sat nearly empty on the table. Jake reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Lynette," he said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I want to spend it with you." My heart swelled at his words, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. This time, it was me who took the leap, who closed the distance between us. And when he kissed me back, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. "Merry Christmas, Lynette," he whispered against my lips when we finally pulled apart. "Merry Christmas, Jake," I replied, my voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. That night was the beginning of something beautiful, something unexpected. And though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to take the journey.